A black old man sitting here alone? Gotta be homeless or hiding something filthy." Officer Darren Cole smirked as he stepped toward Jameis Brooks, 79 years old, a civil rights veteran. No evidence, no reason, just skin color and a badge weaponized by prejudice. But what he didn't know, that old man once made a racist system kneel, and this time won't be any different. Within 48 hours, the stone bench he tried to turn into a stage for humiliation will become the spark that sets his entire system on fire. What state do you live in? Florida, Alabama, California. If this happened at your local park, would you stay silent or rise up? 6:30 a.m. Clearwater Park still dozed in the damp chill of young grass. The first light of day, thin as thread, filtered through the shedding oaks and fell gently onto the old stone bench, nestled in the brick pathway. A few squirrels darted past the bushes, and the distant hum of a garbage truck echoed softly from a far-off street, like the slow heartbeat of a city not quite awake. And on that bench, as every morning, sat James Brooks, a 79-year-old black man with a spine straight as a ruler, his hand resting on a finely carved ebony cane, his gaze untouched by age. He had once served in the Air Force. Everyone knew that, but few remembered. He had faced down police lines during the 1965 Voting Rights March and had once been handcuffed simply for refusing to move to the back of a segregated bus. He never recounted those milestones as acts of heroism. He kept them instead in an old leather satchel, what he called the living memory that must not vanish. A collection he'd assembled himself over 3 months, handwritten letters, photographs, reports, and yellowed news articles soon to be donated to the Charleston Historical Society. No one ever saw him give speeches, but everyone noticed he was there. Each morning he sat without fanfare, without a word, just present, like a steadfast fold in the fabric of time, pulled tight by a new century. The wind brushed through the trees, blending the scent of sunlight and damp grass into the air. An elderly couple passed by and nodded. James smiled faintly, smoothing a page in his weathered leather notebook. Beside him lay Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King, Jr. He reread the final passage weekly, a private reminder. There was something in those words that made him believe he still owed time a debt, even if his legs were. Occasionally, children would approach, pointing at his cane. "Is that magic, mister?" He would smile and reply, "Not for hittin'. It's so I don't fall," in every sense. The children didn't fully understand, but somehow they didn't forget either. One morning, a young park employee came over and reminded him of a new rule: no sitting more than 45 minutes without physical activity. James looked at him calmly and said, "I used to walk miles, just for the right to sit at the same table as someone like you." The young man backed off, awkward. The next day, the sign was gone. James didn't seek confrontation, but he never yielded either. Then one time a college student sat beside him, curious. "What do you think of our generation?" He answered slowly, like a monk. "Every generation has its awakened and its followers of the times." Then he spoke of the early days of the Freedom Riders, of bricks hurled at buses, of how he once gripped a friend's hand tightly to hold on to courage. The young woman sat silent, put down her phone, hearing a story for the first time not from a textbook, but from someone who'd lived it. The city was still stirring when James closed his eyes and took a long breath. Then footsteps approached, firm, deliberate, not casual. The kind of footsteps trained by uniform boots, each one landing like it meant to stamp authority into the ground. James didn't open his eyes, but his body recognized it. This sound, this rhythm, he had heard it all his life. It came with orders, with controlling stares, with the weight of being watched. The steps stopped. No greeting, no small talk, just a thick silence, as if someone stood directly in front of him, observing him like a subject under scrutiny. A voice rang out, clipped, void of basic courtesy. "This area is under city inspection. What are you doing here?" James opened his eyes slowly. The wind shifted. A navy mool shadow stretched across his worn leather shoes. A tall young man stood there, tools hanging from his belt, a badge glinting in the sun, his eyes heavy with suspicion. James said nothing right away. He had lived long enough to know Some battles don't begin with fists or guns, but with a stare and a tone. Today, he faced such a battle again, but he didn't rise. He remained still. His hand stayed on his notebook, his cane resting beside him like a spine extending from memory itself. He knew if he didn't sit here, no one would carry this memory into the morning. And if memory isn't brought forward, it disappears like old moss under a fresh coat of paint in a city eager to scrub its past. James looked directly at the man, not angrily, but with depth, calm, and resolve. And in that moment, every detail around him, the slanting light on his shoulder, the rustle of oak leaves, the heavy leather bag by his foot, became quiet proof of a truth. He didn't need to raise his voice to be a witness of his time. He stood there, feet shoulder-thin apart, ready to step in, to act, or to step back and call for more authority. Half a head taller than most, chest puffed out like a challenge to the space around him. One hand hovered near his waist where the baton hung, a silent reminder it could be used at any time. The other arm hung loose, relaxed and flexible, as if waiting for the smallest movement from the man opposite to turn observation into action. His uniform was still crisp and new. Not because he was neat, but because he hadn't done anything truly demanding since being assigned to this area. Darren Cole, a police officer temporarily transferred from a small town down south, was the kind of man who carried a bias wrapped in a professional shell. He didn't yell in people's faces. He didn't swing his baton like in those viral videos online, but he knew exactly how many words to use to make someone feel like a threat. He didn't belittle people loudly. He did it by asking unnecessary questions, by holding eye contact longer than needed, by standing just a little too close. Not close enough to break the rules, but close enough to say, "I have power, you don't." He had spotted James Brooks from a distance, an old black man sitting quietly on a park bench, book in hand, nothing unusual. But it was that very nothing that caught his attention, because he'd been trained, or more accurately conditioned, to see risk not in obvious actions, but in unclear presence. An older man doing nothing, sitting alone for too long, he saw that as unusual, and as a reflex, he needed to control it. He approached. No greeting, no introduction, no smile. "Identification," he said, voice just loud enough for others nearby to hear, but not so loud as to seem aggressive. He knew how to tune his tone to irritate without crossing legal lines. "Do you have it on you?" James didn't respond right away. He just looked at him, not startled, not angry, not afraid. The calmness in his gaze nearly made Darren frown. He'd met men like James before, in places he'd rather forget. Once, he'd seen that same look in someone's eyes before a protest erupted at his old station. He still remembered the chill down his spine when that man had said, "We saw you before you were even born." Darren tried to shake off the memory. This wasn't Mississippi. This was a new district. He had things to prove to his superiors, and he wouldn't let some old man throw him off track. "I sit here every morning. Been 3 years now," James replied. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. "Didn't ask how often you sit. I asked if you have ID. I have it, but what are you going to do with it?" "We're conducting a patrol. There have been reports of suspicious individuals loitering, approaching pedestrians." It was a rehearsed script, a vague, generic rationale, just legal enough to justify it. He didn't need evidence, just what they called a professional hunch, though deep down, he knew. What truly bothered him was the stillness on that man's face, the unguarded resolve, the quiet defiance of someone just sitting. James let out a short, dry laugh, not because it was funny, but because he'd heard that line since 1962. Suspicious individuals. Those 2 words had been enough to drag people off buses, out of cafes, off park benches. Nearly 60 years later, the phrase was still being repeated verbatim, like a lazy photocopy of a history that never learned. And men like Darren Cole, he'd met them before. He knew they didn't ask questions to get answers. They asked to assert that they were the answer. James slowly set down his book, glancing at the worn leather bag beside him. He didn't rush. He didn't stall. No sudden moves. Everything was clear enough to show he had nothing to hide, but also clear enough to show he didn't intend to obey unconditionally. He wasn't refusing to show ID out of rebellion. He just knew too well, with men like Darren Cole, handing it over changed nothing. They didn't ask to listen. They asked to measure compliance. Something else was being tested here. Not identity, but obedience. And James had never been trained to perform obedience for anyone. Darren Cole hesitated for a second. He hadn't expected that kind of silence. Not fearful. Not passive, a silence that understood too much. One that touched a part of him he tried to forget. No, he wasn't afraid of this 79-year-old man. He just felt inconvenienced. Inconvenienced by being seen in that way, not with disdain, not with pleading, but with eyes that had witnessed too much to be intimidated by the cheap authority he was wielding. No bowing, no resisting, but no looking away either. That gaze, as if James had already seen everything, including the consequences, and still sat there. And Darren had seen that look before, somewhere else, in that small town full of oak trees, sunlight, and more problems than any map could show. A teen boy had been detained. No clear reason, just acting suspicious near a jewelry store, even though he was just walking home from the basketball court. One late night, the station had been surrounded by 100 people. No shouting, no vandalism, just standing there, eyes just like James, quiet, unafraid, demanding answers. Darren remembered the suffocating feeling that how the neon lights in the duty room couldn't pierce through the unspoken judgment of a community. He had been transferred. On paper, it was voluntary resignation due to personal reasons, but everyone knew he was pulled out before anyone had to face a camera. He had promised himself it wouldn't happen again. He wouldn't let someone like that, young or old, black or not, stand between him and the power he was trying to hold on to. Here he was still new, still trusted, still had a chance to build a reputation, and he wasn't about to let an old black man, sloppily dressed, sitting on a park bench, ruin that. You refusing to cooperate? He changed his tone. Still calm, but pressing down on each word. A way of speaking not meant to ask, but to corner. James simply shook his head, unfazed. I'm just sitting here. If that makes you uncomfortable, then the problem isn't with me. His voice wasn't loud, but it echoed in the still space between them, like a pebble dropped into still water, sending ripples of truth, too small to erase, but impossible to ignore. Darren stiffened. The words weren't an attack, but they stripped off the invisible armor he wore for confidence. The old man didn't need to shout, didn't need to stand, and still, Darren felt exposed inside the uniform he thought was his shield. He turned his head slightly, not out of fear, but to look away from the feeling rising in him, one he couldn't quite name. The breeze skimmed the bench again, but it no longer felt cool. The space grew tense, as if the whole park was holding its breath for what might happen next. A faint click on Darren's radio. Backup was on its way. He pressed the button to respond briefly, eyes still on James. It was time, he thought. Time for this old man, and anyone else watching from a distance, to see who the law really was. Darren pressed the radio button, his voice low and clipped. Unit 43, requesting support to verify identification at the east side of Clearwater Park. The subject refused to present ID. Not resisting, but shows signs of non-compliance. In his ear came the clicking static of a response, cold and indifferent, just like the system he represented. 2 units confirmed arrival within 5 minutes. He exhaled, not out of fatigue, but to keep his face neutral, showing nothing but control. He stepped around the bench, standing at an angle behind Jamin. The risk reduction tactic described in the manual. But he knew this wasn't defense. This was dominance. A silent declaration. I'm above, and you're not. James stayed seated. His back didn't slouch, nor stiffen in resistance. He simply sat, as he had every morning for the past 3 years. But today felt different. His eyes didn't leave Darren, not challenging, but not avoiding. That look made Darren feel, for a fleeting second, as if he were being assessed, and that, more than any words, unnerved him. He needed this old man to yield, not physically, but symbolically, with a nod, a retreat, a silent concession. "Show me your ID," Darren said again, his voice low but heavy, like a stone pressed to the throat. "If not, I'll proceed with enforcement measures. No pleas, no softening, each word chosen like a lead slug. Bloodless but sharp enough to cut." James glanced down at his leather bag and unzipped it slowly, with the calm of someone performing an ordinary task, neither pressured nor coerced. He sifted through layers of old paper, photos, letters, yellowed clippings, not hurried, but slow enough to feel intentional. Finally, he pulled out a plastic-sleeved paper card, worn and scratched, its print nearly faded. No logo, no photo, no color, just a relic of a different time. He didn't hand it over, he placed it on his lap, gently, as if it held no worth but also needed no defense. The gesture wasn't threatening, but its quiet certainty gave Darren pause. He didn't know why he hadn't snatched it, maybe because for the first time he sensed his authority badge, and all might not be the most powerful thing present. A discomfort crept up Darren's throat, like he had swallowed something jagged. Why was he still frozen? That little unreadable card sat on an old black man's lap in a public park. Nothing stopped Darren from taking it. No rule required hesitation. He was in charge. He was the law. So why did he feel small? Not because of the card, because of how James placed it there, without plea or challenge, as if he didn't need to prove who he was, as if he didn't need Darren's acknowledgement. Darren turned to the sound of footsteps. 2 officers appeared along the path. 1 woman, 1 man. They didn't run. They walked calmly, scanning the scene. When close enough to understand the moment, they neither greeted Darren nor questioned James. They just stood there, waiting for the man who called for backup to give instructions. But Darren gave no orders. He didn't move, didn't reach for cuffs, didn't take the card. He stood there, shadow falling over James, and yet felt himself being swallowed by it. "I once showed this card in a place where I was nearly beaten to death for not having it," James said, voice rough but clear, slicing the thick air. "I carry it now not to protect myself, but to remind me that sometimes a piece of paper is the only thing between life and death." No one responded, not because they didn't understand, but because they did. The words needed no confirmation. They carried the weight of a life trampled by the system, now sitting here, not demanding justice or vengeance, but simply holding his posture steady, a posture the world had tried too many times to break. That faded card became a living proof of something Darren and men like him spent their careers denying, that some people don't need weapons or laws, just the refusal to bow to disarm an entire system. Darren swallowed hard. Sweat prickled his neck. Though the sun was still soft, the 2 officers behind him said nothing, but he knew their gaze on him, on James, had changed. The order in his mind, the framework built from rules, hierarchy, procedure, was cracking. He'd come to enforce control, but somehow authority had left him and taken a seat on that bench. A question rose in his mind, unnamed and unwelcome. If he grabbed the card, would he win? Or would he only prove what the old man had silently accused, that what Darren held wasn't law, but pettiness in uniform? No one moved. All 3 officers remained still, and Darren, though still standing, was now the smallest figure in the entire scene. At the farthest corner of the park, where old trees weaved their canopies to dim the stone path, stood a man in a dark hoodie, leaning against a lamppost as if he were part of the scenery. The hood hung low, shading part of his face, and the shifting morning light failed to catch anything from his eyes. No one noticed when he had arrived. He wasn't on his phone, didn't move closer, didn't fidget. He simply stood still. Yet every movement in the space between James Brooks and Officer Darren Cole was within his line of sight, like a silent witness or a prosecutor in an unofficial courtroom. His eyes followed every detail, Cole's hand hovering near his gun, not drawn, but not tucked away either. The suspicious glance when James produced an old ID card. Cole muttered something into his radio, likely suggesting the card was probably fake. The disdain was clear in his eyes as he observed James, plain clothes, elderly, seated on a stone bench. looking like a homeless man. To Darren, that appearance alone was enough to trigger the silent judgment system long embedded in him. He needed no reason, just a profile. Nathaniel Chambers knew this kind of cop all too well. They never shout, never abuse power the old-fashioned way. They use reasonable-sounding words, seemingly proper procedure, and apparently objective logic to disguise instincts trained by bias. He had faced dozens like Darren in civil rights hearings, but what reports could never show was the look in their eyes. The way a man reaches for his waistband without realizing he's threatening a life. As Darren stepped forward, bending down to snatch the card, James didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto the officer. No panic, no defiance. Just the steady calm of a man who had once been beaten down, but never stripped of his dignity. And in that moment, when power pretended to enforce law, but was really just trying to push a man into the dirt out of frustration, Nathaniel quietly left the lamppost. Darren began to push James off the bench, not violently, but firmly enough to make the frail body hesitate. One hand pulled back, he was about to cuff him in broad daylight in the middle of the park, in front of two fellow officers who still hadn't grasped what was happening, and in full view of the man in the black hoodie walking steadily toward him. No one in the park knew that man's name was Nathaniel Chambers, but anyone in the legal field, with just a glimpse beneath that hood, would know this was no ordinary man. Nathaniel was the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, head of the Federal Civil Rights Violations Unit, one of the most powerful figures in the Department of Justice, with the authority to suspend any police department found engaging in systemic abuse. But today he didn't arrive with a task force. No name tag or press team. He didn't want to read about it later through reports and emails. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. The moment justice silently dies, when an old man sitting quietly on a bench is seen as a threat to public order. And now he had. Darren leaned another step. He wasn't sure what he was about to do. Grab the ID off James's lap, twist his arm for the cuffs, or simply force him to stand so Darren wouldn't have to look up anymore. But just then, when his hand was inches from the old man's shoulder, a subtle movement at the edge of his vision made him pause. A man stepped out from the shadows. Not fast, not slow, but with a deliberate pace, as though each step had been calibrated with the precision of someone who knew that in a few seconds all eyes would be on him. The hood came down, his face emerged under the pale morning light. Not young, not old, weathered by things he didn't need to say aloud. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to gesture. His presence alone was enough to shift the weight of the air within 5 meters. The backup officers, one narrowing her eyes, the other subtly clenching his sleeve, immediately redirected their focus. They didn't know the man's name, but the way he moved, the upright posture, the unflinching gaze, it activated every professional instinct they had. They didn't draw their weapons, didn't make a call, they waited. Darren turned, instantly on guard. He didn't recognize this man. He didn't like strangers in situations he thought he controlled. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, but it vanished when the man pulled from his coat a hard plastic ID, the kind that glinted faintly in the sun. He held it up at just the right angle, not waving it, not shaking it, just enough for everyone in law enforcement to instantly understand. A thin gold trim surrounded the U.S. Department of Justice seal. Below, in bold, unmistakable letters, Nathaniel Chambers, Deputy Attorney General, USS Department of Justice. Officer Cole. Nathaniel's voice rang out, low, firm, unwavering, devoid of anger. Each word carried a thin layer of ice, sharp as cut glass. You are to immediately terminate this interaction and withdraw from the scene. A federal review of your conduct will begin today, under direct oversight. No one moved. No one objected, not even a whisper, only the sound of wind meeting resistance. The sparrows in the grass went silent, as if someone had severed their strings, as if they too sensed something had shifted. Beneath Darren's feet, the ground that once felt solid now seemed unstable, as if the invisible chair of authority he had sat on just lost a leg. He pressed his lips together, said nothing. His hand clenched, thumb over the radio button, but he didn't press it. His whole body locked, not by guns, not by orders, but by the weight of 3 stares. Nathaniel's icy calm, the female officer's confusion, the male officer's waiting hesitation. James, still seated, still unmoved, still in the same position, but now he was the center of all real authority. Darren wanted to say something, anything to regain control, but his throat was dry. Every excuse would sound like a protest from someone just caught in the act. He felt like a boy caught hiding chalk in his pocket in front of the principal. He hated that feeling. He hated Nathaniel's presence. He hated the quiet look from James Brooks. The look without anger, without judgment, yet piercing through the last layer of power he clung to. James tilted his head slightly toward Nathaniel, not to thank him, but like a subtle nod between 2 men who recognized each other through the wreckage of a long-broken system. They had never met. But that look, the look of someone who had seen more than a report could ever contain, was unmistakable. Darren finally stepped back. No one told him to, but he knew. He couldn't stand there any longer without losing what little posture he had left. No one noticed the young woman standing at the edge of the grass across from the stone bench, at least not during the first 15 minutes. She wore jeans and a gray t-shirt, holding her smartphone like millions of others do every day. But what made her different was this: she had already hit record the moment Darren leaned in close to James. She didn't shout, didn't intervene, didn't cause a scene. She simply filmed, and that silent act shook an entire city in less than 24 hours. The 3-minute, 47-second CEI video began with James sitting calmly, hand resting on his leather satchel, sunlight angled across the bridge of his nose. Then came Darren's shadow falling over him, the questioning, James's measured responses. The paper ID card was placed on his lap, his steady eyes fixed on the officer, and then the gentle shove from Darren, the old man's arm pulled behind him, right as Nathaniel stepped out from beneath the trees, lowering his cap and flashing a Department of Justice badge. There was no soundtrack, no edits, no captions, just raw footage. But that rawness carried real weight. The breathing, the rustle of leaves, Darren's hesitant tone, and the sharp voice declaring, "I'm instructing you to end this interaction immediately," slicing through the moment like a blade between 2 worlds. The clip was posted at 8:32 a.m. by user @GiaFields92. In the first 10 minutes, it received only a few comments and scattered likes, but by minute 11, when a local attorney reposted it with the caption, "Not every black man sitting in a park is a threat. Sometimes they are living proof of what the system tried to forget," the clip went viral. By noon, the hashtag #ManOnTheBench was trending in Twitter's top 5. Edited versions of the video spread like wildfire on Facebook and TikTok. Some fast forward just to catch the moment Nathaniel flashed his badge. Others analyzed every expression, every line of dialogue. One account even reconstructed a map of the park to prove James had not been wandering close to pedestrians, as initially alleged. But within 6 hours, the video had over 3.2 million views across platforms. Not because of slick editing, not because of a celebrity face, but because of a painfully familiar paradox. Calm, mistaken for threat, and power exposed by the one person it couldn't break. Pressure mounted by the minute. By early afternoon, local news outlets were running headlines like "Tension in Clearwater Park," video shows "Coercion by Charleston Police." National networks like NBC and CNN quickly picked up the story. That evening, the video aired in full, unblurred. The anchor read each line of the caption, slowly. The man in the video is James Brooks, 79, a former Air Force officer and civil rights activist. The intervening individual is Nathaniel Chambers, U.S. Deputy Attorney General. Questions poured into the Charleston Police Department. Who was the officer present? Why was the elderly man being questioned without clear violation? Why did it take federal authority to stop an unjust arrest of a senior citizen? And why must citizens film injustice for justice to even move? At first, the police remained silent, but by nightfall, with the Department of Justice announcing a formal investigation into potential misconduct, they were forced to release a press statement. Cold, evasive, using the phrase internal procedural review. But the public didn't accept that. On a popular black radio show, the longtime host said, "We're tired of procedural. What we need is human." The next day's press conference became a media battlefield. Over 40 journalists showed up. When the police spokesperson took the podium, camera flashes burst. Trying to sound professional, he said, "We're cooperating with federal entities to clarify," but he was cut off. One reporter stood and asked, "Then why was he still about to be taken in? The man's older than my father." Another jumped in, "If that phone hadn't been recording, what would have happened?" The answer, no one knows, and that's exactly why people wouldn't let it go. At the same time, Nathaniel Chambers' office released a short statement. A federal special investigation has been opened concerning unlawful, coercive conduct by a Charleston officer toward a lawful citizen. Further details will be available within 72 hours. The local community didn't stay quiet. At a spontaneous gathering at the city's cultural center, hundreds came, not to protest but to share. One woman stood and said, "My father was stopped at a bus terminal too, just because he wore an old coat and carried a wooden cane." A middle-aged man held up a photo. "This is my uncle, detained for being mistaken as homeless. But he was a veteran." James's story was no longer just his. It had struck a collective nerve. Hidden under administrative language and incident reports labeled reasonable suspicion. From social media to real life, people began to see Clearwater Park differently. Flowers appeared on the bench where James had sat. Someone chalked a message across the backrest. "We saw, and this time we won't forget." That morning, the Charleston Police Department opened earlier than usual. The sky was cloudless, yet the sunlight seemed quiet, as if waiting for someone to pass by. James Brooks walked slowly along the stone-paved sidewalk, his ebony cane tapping steadily against the ground. Clack, clack, like the heartbeat of the city itself, listening. He wore an old white shirt, a dark brown vest, and his familiar smoke-colored fabric hat. No badge, no special credentials. But as he reached the front steps, two young officers posted at the main entrance stood at attention, nodding in salute as if before a historical figure. The revolving door opened, and for the first time in over 4 decades, James entered the police headquarters through the front. The last time he had entered, more accurately been pushed in, it was through the back door. Hands cuffed, cheek bloodied by a punch during an old interrogation. They had asked him then, "Who do you think is going to care about a black man yelling in the street?" and left him in a freezer-cold room, under flickering fluorescent lights and walls stained with handprints. But today he was not the one answering. He was the one being heard. A female staff member led the way, polite, not performative. "This way, Mr. Brooks, hearing room, 2nd floor." Her voice was soft, but to James it sounded like music after years of silence. Carpeted stairs, well-lit hallways, the hearing room door already open, not to guard, but to welcome. Inside, representatives from the Department of Justice, the state court clerk, and several legal advisors were already seated. No handcuffs, no two-way mirrors, just pens, paper, and respect. As James entered, the first to rise was the elder federal inspector. "We know we're witnessing something more than just a statement," he said. "We're here to hear you, not about one day, but about a lifetime." James nodded slightly. He didn't smile, but there was a rare softness in his eyes, because he knew this wasn't a moment of triumph. This was a moment when a door long locked had finally opened, and he could walk through it without bowing. James sat upright on the wooden chair in the hearing room, his hand resting on the cane he always carried. In front of him, a small microphone, a blank pad of paper, and waiting eyes. No one forced him to speak, but no one interrupted either. He took a deep breath, not to find courage, but to steady the flood of unnamed memories. "Last week," he began, "I was sitting in the park like I do every day. I wasn't begging, I wasn't making noise, I was just sitting, and then an officer approached. asked what I had in my bag, demanded to see ID. His voice wasn't loud, but it struck the tiled floor of memory like a chisel. I looked at him and saw again the faces of those who'd looked at me the same way, in Montgomery, in Jackson, in Birmingham. He paused. The scene returned in his mind, the shadow of a blue uniform cast over the bench, a hand clenched near the baton, a frown at an old paper ID, and the same familiar feeling, not fear, but a bone-deep exhaustion. We still have to remind them that we are human. He spoke plainly, no embellishment, no tears, but in each word was the echo of lost names. Elijah, knocked unconscious during the 1965 march. Claudine, the girlfriend jailed for 2 nights just for handing out water to protesters. Marcus, the soldier who once stood between backpacks and banners, now a portrait in a church hallway. I'm not the only one who ever sat on a bench. Many have stood in the streets just to demand the right to live with dignity, and then they were arrested, cursed, humiliated, simply because they didn't walk away when told to move along. He looked directly at the federal representative. That bench wasn't a resting place. It was a test for the system itself. His voice was low, but tight. I almost stood up, but I knew that if I did, thousands more would be forced to bow. So I stayed seated, not because I'm strong, but because others once stood behind me when I was young, and now it's my turn to hold the line for the next generation. A quiet moment followed. Then he spoke of Nathaniel, not with ceremony, but like recalling a silent companion. When I saw him step out from the trees, I knew I wasn't alone. I didn't need his rank. I just saw his eyes. The eyes not of someone trying to rescue me, but of someone who understood. Doing nothing is complicity. James didn't call Nathaniel a hero. He simply said, some people inside the system aren't swallowed by it, and if we don't hold on to those people, then everything we've ever walked through will be erased. He nodded, a light motion as if touching memory. I'm not here to demand justice just for myself. I speak for those who haven't had their chance yet. You are not crazy, not weak, and not wrong to ask for respect. The closing wasn't a pledge. It was a purposeful question. If a 79-year-old man still has to prove he isn't a threat, who among you will speak up when I no longer can? While most media attention was focused on the park video, elsewhere, in a quiet corner of the city, a brief meeting took place. Without cameras, without signatures, yet carrying a weight no report could fully capture. Nathaniel Chambers sat alone in a temporary meeting room borrowed by the Department of Justice from an old administrative building. The table was bare, the lights dim yellow, the windows drawn shut. He was reviewing James Brooks' interview transcript when a soft knock sounded. 3 taps. Not urgent, but steady. A young man in plain clothes stepped in. Luis Ortega, he introduced himself quietly, placing a hand on a faded old name badge. Nathaniel nodded and gestured for him to sit. No questions needed. He knew that when an officer requested a private meeting with a deputy attorney general at 7 p.m., what he was about to say couldn't be written in a standard report. Luis got straight to the point. His voice was low and quick, as if he needed to get everything out before someone could stop him. I'm a patrol officer from the West Charleston district. I joined 4 years ago. Things were fine at first, but after 2 years, I started seeing things I couldn't stay quiet about. He recounted, a white colleague stopping a black student riding a bike. No license plate, no clear offense. The boy was held for over an hour, simply because he looked like he might be carrying something in his bag. Then came a Latina woman, Luis's neighbor, detained for speaking strangely when calling emergency services for her husband. And there were random stops that always seemed to target people who weren't white. I filed internal reports, Luis said slowly, eyes fixed on the table. I listed dates, times, and names, included photos. 3 weeks later, I was reassigned to admin work. They said it fit my soft skills better. Luis felt enthusiasm. Nathaniel stayed. He knew that kind of language. Phrases soft as velvet, sharp as blades. No longer fit for field duty. Position under evaluation, internal restructuring, words used to sideline inconvenient voices without needing to fire them. Lewis placed a small USB on the table. I don't have much, but there are some internal emails, texts, phone photos. I know the James case is just the surface. What's beneath the ice is what's truly rotten. No oath, no drama, but in that quiet room, a new story began, and this time it came from the inside. Nathaniel inserted the USB into his personal laptop while Luis sat silently beside him, hands clenched under the table as if bracing for some inevitable blow. The screen lit up a simple folder, internal_obcefs_Luiso. Inside were 3 text files, 12 screenshots of emails, and 2 PDFs of internal memos, everything time-stamped from late last year. The first email was an exchange between Luis and his direct superior, Lieutenant Dale Kerr. Subject line, Personal Stop Incident, -11/12. In it, Luis detailed how an officer detained a 14-year-old black teenager in a parking lot near the station for looking nervous, despite finding no signs of wrongdoing. Luis requested a meeting to review patrol protocols. The reply came 7 minutes later. No procedural violations. You should focus on your own assignments. The second email, sent at 11 p.m. by a deputy team leader, read, Luis, I don't recommend you keep pushing this. In this job, loyalty to the structure matters more than your sense of right and wrong. Nathaniel squinted. The language wasn't an explicit threat, but it reeked of smoke, of a system that didn't need to act, only to make silence feel like the only option left. Luis continued, peeling back layers of long compacted ash. The last time I tried to escalate a questionable case to internal affairs, I was called into the office. No record, no investigation, just advice that I reconsider my future in law enforcement. His voice caught slightly, but it didn't shake. After that, I was pulled from patrol. The internal memo said I volunteered to transfer to help with data analysis. I never submitted any request. Nathaniel opened the next text file, a draft testimony Luis had written for the state inspector's office but never submitted. The reason was simple. The contact officer he planned to approach had abruptly resigned for personal reasons. Every line in the document showed a clear, repeating pattern. Unjustified detainments, arbitrary stops, no official citation, and vague legal-sounding notes to preempt liability. Everything was done carefully enough to avoid lawsuits, but plainly enough that anyone looking closely could see this wasn't an isolated issue. At last, Nathaniel shut the laptop and leaned back. He knew what he'd seen wouldn't explode overnight, but it was a real spark, clear and concrete enough to lay the groundwork for a deeper probe from the inside. And more importantly, the one lighting the path wasn't a politician or a journalist, but a young officer who had once been forced into silence yet chose to speak. On the 3rd floor of the Charleston Police Department headquarters, in a command office deliberately set apart from daily operations, an unscheduled emergency meeting was underway. The windows were drawn, hallway cameras marked as under maintenance, and no one was allowed to take notes upon entry. 6 men sat around the table, all high-ranking officers, from the head of internal affairs to the deputy chief of local oversight, wore a different expression: worry, indifference, and even resentment. The first to speak was Lieutenant Colonel Roland Mercer, retired 2 years ago but still wielded indirect influence through loyal connections. We have a problem, and it didn't start with the old man on the bench. The problem is that Chambers showed up. The problem is that Kid Ortega wouldn't stay quiet. He slapped his hand on the table, not loudly. His anger came from the kind of power used to control everything with a nod, never needing to issue commands. Another voice cut in, Deputy Chief Clement Walsh, head of internal records. I've checked. What Ortega has is just the surface. But if he reopens the Red Pines case from 2018, we're in real trouble. No one said a word. No need to revisit the details. Everyone knew the Red Pines incident had been handled internally, with stunning silence. A 17-year-old black boy was stopped at 10 p.m. for walking without a clear purpose. Officer involved, Darren Cole. The report listed it as a verbal warning, no infraction. But the original sketch of the incident had clearly noted forced to kneel, firearm touching the knee. The investigation was closed within 48 hours due to lack of evidence. It never reached the public. Cole is still the weak point, someone else said. He lacks control, lacks discretion, and he's been under watch even before the park incident. Mercer nodded. He was kept on because of strong backing, but if this story spreads to the Attorney General's office, no one's strong enough to stop what's coming. This time is different. The air in the room thickened. Someone set down a coffee cup, murmuring as if speaking to himself. It's spreading, but we can still contain it, if the right person is handled at the right time. Eyes turned toward one another. No names were said, but everyone understood. Either sacrifice a few pawns to preserve the board, or let it all collapse. An internal call connected to the emergency operations room. On the other end, a state-level deputy inspector general, voice deep and measured. Don't let this spread. Don't let it leave the city. If disciplinary action is needed, do it before the feds do it for us. At the far end of the table, Clement opened his laptop, projecting an unsent report titled only, Recommendation for Disciplinary Action, Darren Cole, High Risk Classification. A soft landing, a scapegoat. But everyone in the room knew this didn't stop with Cole. The terrifying part was this. They had all once agreed to let him exist. And now, it seemed, the monster they created had outlived the plan. We need to control the narrative, Mercer concluded. Don't let the press get more, don't let Chambers gain more witnesses, and more importantly, don't let the public believe this is the first time it's happened. Everyone nodded. No one asked questions. A few hours later, a neatly worded internal memo was drafted. Contents. The Charleston Police Department confirms it is currently reviewing personnel involved in procedures under internal evaluation, all within internal protocol. No outlet was allowed to quote it directly. No names were included. But in the shadows, the system had begun to crack, and the first sound of that fracture was fear of being seen. The east basement of the old city hall was a place few people ever visited. The ceiling hung low, red brick walls cracked and crumbling, and flickering fluorescent lights buzzed like a city's memory, too afraid to look back at itself. Nathaniel Chambers stood in front of a steel door, labeled Archive Dachman's, Internal Access Only. Beside him was Luis Ortega, holding a paper inventory sheet requested from the local Administrative Review Bureau. One file code on the list had been crossed out 3 times, with a faded note beside it. No retrieval. Case closed. Transfer code unknown. Why was the transfer code wiped, but the file's still here? Nathaniel asked. Louise didn't respond. He just lowered his head, as if returning to this place chilled him more than he could admit. The room was colder than expected. Moldy air mixed with the scent of old paper and rusted metal. Rows of aging steel cabinets lined the walls, each drawer marked with numbers and brittle, yellowed tape labels. Luis ran his hand across the units until he stopped at cabinet 7B. He pulled out a medium-sized file folder wrapped in wrinkled sea-green paper. Across the top, a red-inked stamp read, Enclosed, No direct access. No words were needed. Both men knew they had just laid hands on something untouched for years, either by fear or by order. Inside were 17 pages. The original incident report, crime scene photos, witness statements, forensic records, and a halfway written summary, missing the final page. Victim, Khalil Jamison, 17 years old, high school student, date of death August 14, 5 years ago. Cause, traumatic brain injury and internal bleeding. Location, behind an abandoned building in South Charleston. On page 5, Luis stopped. The scene intervention section clearly stated. First responder, Officer Darren Cole. Report notes, suspect resisted arrest. Subdued using standard procedure. No body cam footage. Nathaniel went still. He read every line slowly, checking the timestamps. The forensics report indicated Khalil's injuries were caused by high-impact, blunt force trauma from behind, at close range using a hard, narrow-surfaced object. But Darren's statement claimed Khalil fell while fleeing. 2 accounts, 1 corpse, and one internal memo the key. Page 14 was a memorandum from the Internal Affairs Inspector at the time, now retired. It read, "There is a clear discrepancy between the severity of injury and Officer Cole's testimony. Recommend immediate suspension pending investigation." But that investigation never happened. 1 week later, the entire file was marked closed due to insufficient evidence of intentional misconduct. Luis clenched his jaw. "They buried this. I'd heard whispers, but never saw it myself." Nathaniel nodded, eyes locked on the final entries. "Well, now we have." He pulled out his phone and began photographing every page, every smudge of ink. "We can't rely on storytelling. We have to let the system indict itself." Outside, public outrage over the park video was still burning. But if this information surfaced, the story would shift from one man's mistreatment to a fatal pattern, shielded by power and silence. The questions loomed. Who authorized the file to be closed? Who removed the investigation memo from circulation? Who had the authority and the motive to keep it buried for 5 years? Nathaniel understood he was now entering the most dangerous phase of the investigation, because a wrongful arrest could be framed as a mistake, but a buried death, systematically ignored, pointed to institutional complicity. Luis stepped out first. He said nothing, but his eyes carried the weight of an unbroken winter. Nathaniel followed, the scanned file still in hand. They didn't look at each other, but both knew this was no longer a fight against one officer. This was about cracking open an entire structure. The morning at the Charleston City Council didn't resemble any ordinary session. For the first time in years, the heavy oak doors opened 2 hours earlier than usual. Outside, on the steps, clusters of people formed quiet lines. Journalists, lawyers, law students, and even citizens who had never set foot in this building but now stood silently waiting. Tripods were set, microphones labeled CNN, NBC, WCVT Local, crowding toward the witness stand where, for the first time, a name was spoken aloud on live television: Luis Ortega. He had never wanted to be the center of attention. In the past, Luis believed that if he followed the rules, quietly filing reports, submitting complaints, complying with internal procedures, change could come through normal channels. But the day he was called into the office, met his superior's eyes, and heard the words, "Just focus on your job," delivered like a sentence that decided both his ideals and his conscience, Luis understood. Silence within the system wasn't an escape, it was complicity. A side door opened. Luis entered the back hallway of the main chamber where a legal officer waited to escort him to the witness room. The hallway lights glowed pale yellow, nowhere near bright enough to ease the feeling he was walking toward a public execution. His heartbeat was slow but steady, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he'd been afraid for so long, fear no longer controlled him. In his coat pocket was the printed testimony he had rewritten 13 times. Less than 5 pages, but each sentence, each period, felt like stripping away layers of the system he once believed could be reformed from within. Luis had no illusions about the consequences. He knew some would scoff, some would push back, some might even want him erased. But one thing he was no longer: silent. Behind the wooden door, the press gallery was full. In the front row sat Nathaniel Chambers, silent. No eye contact, no nod, just his presence, like a quiet anchor. The aisle-side benches were reserved for the public. Luis heard murmurs from outside. "That's the one who got transferred for speaking up, right? Does he have proof? If this is true, they'll have to reopen all those buried cases." The internal door opened. A clerk signaled. Luis took a breath, once, twice, then stood and walked toward the spotlight waiting at the end of the hall. The first sound as Luis stepped up wasn't his voice. It was the synchronized clicking of camera shutters, as if the whole room had been holding its breath for this exact moment to etch into history. Luis stood tall, both hands lightly placed on the edge of the stand. He didn't look at the cameras, nor did he fixate on the paper. His gaze was straight at the city council 9 members, staring at him, unsure whether he was a threat, an ally, or a political nightmare. "My name is Luis Ortega," he began, his voice steady but with unmistakable weight. "I have served as a police officer in Charleston for 4.5 years. I am not here to create a scandal. I am here because I once believed this system could be repaired from within, but I was wrong." The words dropped like a heavy stone into still water, shattering the masks many on the council had worked hard to keep intact. Luis didn't shout. He didn't accuse with slogans. He told stories. The first time he witnessed someone detained without cause. The way a supervisor responded. The single line quietly rewritten in a report. He told of the time he sent an email, was summoned, and was warned that if he kept digging up small stuff, he could forget about career growth. He told of colleagues who once considered speaking out but stayed quiet. For a daughter starting college, for a mother recovering from surgery, for the logic that staying silent at least keeps your health insurance. "I brought evidence," he said, holding up printed documents from a USB drive. "No slideshow needed. Screenshots of messages, unsigned internal reports, and patrol notes pointing to violations that were ignored." One council member jolted forward. "You confirm these materials involve Officer Darren Cole?" "Not just him," Luis answered, unwavering, "but the chain of people who kept him wearing a badge." That line cracked the room open. Journalists reached for their phones, fingers scrolling fast. Citizens poured into the back rows of the chamber. They didn't chant. They stood in stillness, as if just standing there was already proof. They saw. And this time, they weren't leaving without answers. Nathaniel Chambers sat unmoving, no notes, but his gaze sharp as steel. One council member nodded to the chairperson. 3 minutes later, an emergency vote was passed, a full departmental investigation, beginning with the Charleston police under federal oversight. Luis stepped down from the stand without applause, but in the eyes of dozens waiting by the door was a silent acknowledgement. Today, the mask fell, and the truth touched the ground. House number 212 on Madison Street wasn't remarkable. Rusted tin roof, a wooden fence missing one slat, a faded blue door. But for James Brooks, every step toward the red brick porch felt heavier than any hearing he had ever attended. He stood before the door, hand resting on his wooden cane like he needed it for real support. In his coat pocket was a reopened case report, the name Khalil Jamison printed clearly in the top left corner, beside a red, case-closed stamp. The mother opened the door. She wasn't surprised. She didn't immediately invite him in. She looked at him, then gave a slight nod, just enough to open the door a little wider, just enough for him to step through. The living room was unnaturally quiet. No TV, no music. On the table sat a simple framed photo. Khalil, smiling in the glow of youth, wearing a 17 basketball jersey, holding a backup graduation cap. Beside it, a candle burned low, small, thin, like time had forgotten this corner long ago. "Thank you for letting me in," James said softly. He offered no further explanation. In his mind, those words were the beginning of an apology that had no words yet. Mrs. Jamison sat down without replying. Her eyes showed no anger, but no forgiveness either. It was the gaze of someone who expected nothing anymore, and for that very reason any return of concern was met with suspicion. James inhaled. "I know I should have come sooner, but the truth is, I already knew." He paused. Each word was slow, like he was learning to be honest with himself. "That year, I read the first news brief in the local paper. 17-year-old dies in collision while fleeing police. I saw it, and I turned the page. The air thickened." He met her eyes, then looked down. "I once told myself maybe it was just an accident. Maybe nothing shady happened. Maybe someone else would look into it. But what truly kept me silent was the fear that if I started asking questions, I wouldn't be able to stop. And I wasn't ready. Not brave enough, not patient enough." A chair scraped in the kitchen. A middle-aged man stepped out. Khalil's father, with graying hair and a jaw clenched like stone. He said nothing, just looked at James as if to ask, "Why are you here now?" when that name has long since faded beneath the soil in the southern cemetery. James stood, unable to sit any longer. "I didn't come for forgiveness. I came because, for the first time, the system had to reopen the file, and I know this time I can't stay on the sidelines, not just to make amends, but because I've carried this failure for 5 years. Every time I passed a police station, every time I saw a young man walking alone down the street, I didn't speak, but I didn't forget. A long silence followed. Mrs. Jemison looked away. The father stepped forward, placing a hand on his son's photo. His voice was rough. Everyone who comes here brings a reason, but Khalil doesn't need reasons. He needs the truth. He deserves to be named. James nodded, eyes red but voice steady. This time, I will name him, in court, in records, and if necessary on every front page so no one calls him an unidentified victim again. He was Khalil Jamison, 17 years old, and the system took his life. He turned and left, not seeking absolution, but this time leaving, like a man who had lifted one stone from his chest, not for comfort, but to make room for responsibility. Monday morning, the City Cultural Center auditorium was packed, no seats left. People stood along the walls. Some sat cross-legged on the floor. They hadn't come by invitation. They came because they heard that the old man from the park bench would speak for the first time since the incident, and this time, not about himself. James Brooks walked out from the wings into a strange silence. No applause, no cheers, but every eye followed him, because everyone knew this story couldn't repeat the old script. One person speaks, then fades. They waited to see. Would he truly step forward, or stop at the safe edge like so many others? James didn't approach the podium. He pulled a chair to the center of the stage and sat. His wooden cane rested against his leg. In his hands was an old case file, binding torn, held together with a dark cloth tie. "I won't retell what you already know," he began, slow and steady. "I was on the park bench. Someone came, tried to pull me up. That story, you know it. But today I'm not here for me. I'm here for someone most of you don't remember. Khalil Jamison." He held up the file. His file was closed, locked. No one wanted to read it. No one was allowed to read it. But today, it's open again. He paused. "And I want us, at least once, to read his name aloud as part of the truth that was never recorded." Someone in the crowd whispered, "Khalil." Then a few more repeated it. No one told them to, but by the third time, the name rippled across rows like a current. A boy was finally being named, after 5 years buried beneath a cold caption. "Victim with no clear misconduct identified." James looked down at the front row, where Khalil's mother held his photo tightly. His father didn't take his eyes off James. James nodded, and for the first time no one called him the brave old man or a witness of history. In that moment, he was a man living and acting in the present. "We talk a lot about reform, about kindness, about progress," James continued. "But if we don't reopen what's been locked, if we don't confront the deaths we've labeled into silence, then all our promises are just fresh paint over cracked walls." He raised his cane. "I once used this to keep from falling. Now I want it to stand for something else, non-compromise. Whether standing or sitting, we must hold our backs straight, never bow to injustice." Applause followed, not loud, not coordinated, but the first sound of shared resolve. A woman from the fourth row stood, eyes misty. "I'm Khalil's aunt, thank you." A high school student raised their phone, filming the moment, posting it with the caption, "He's no longer just sitting, he stood." That evening, the short clip of James's speech spread across hundreds of pages. The hashtag Say His Name appeared again, this time attached to the name. At police headquarters, the federal inspector's office received over 4,000 petitions to reopen the case. And at the mayor's office, a secretary received a message from an unnamed sender. "Don't forget, the man on the bench stood up, and this time, no one can stop him from walking forward." Nightfall came slower than usual. The city's central square had been cleared into an open space. Folding chairs packed tightly, groups of people lining the sidewalks. No banners, no loudspeakers, but everyone knew tonight the old man from the park, the one who had been asked for ID just for sitting still, was going to speak. James Brooks didn't stand on a high podium. He didn't need to. A low wooden platform, a simple microphone on a metal stand. That was enough. He appeared in a white shirt and brown fabric jacket, just as he had on countless mornings before. Still the same old wooden cane. But this time, instead of resting it by his side, he held it upright before him, like an unspoken declaration. "There are people who've told me," James began, his voice clear, "that I should feel lucky to still be here, that I was helped, rescued, and I should be grateful for that. But let me be clear, I'm not here because someone allowed it. I stand here because I am alive, still breathing, and I won't spend my last breath thanking pity. Not a sound. The wind brushed past the stage but couldn't move the silence, thick as glass." James continued, without raising his voice. "I've been silent before. The first time was when a boy I knew was arrested in the street for running the wrong way. I saw it, I knew it, and I said nothing. I told myself, he'll be fine. And then one day he didn't come home." His eyes swept over the crowd, not blaming, but not offering unconditional absolution either. "We were raised being told that silence is wisdom, that stepping back is being respectful, that surviving is winning. But I'm standing here to say this: if the price of survival is silence in the face of someone else's death, then that's not a victory, it's complicity." A quiet, "That's right," rang out from the back of the square, then another, not a chorus, but like the first cracks in ice. "Don't turn me into a symbol," James said. "Don't call me a hero. I've stepped back before, I've looked away, and if you think you're too small, that you can't do anything, then remember, it's exactly because too many people thought that way that a name like Khalil Jameson was buried in records for 5 years. James paused, then raised his cane to chest height, his voice steadier than the wind. "I'm no longer sitting on the bench. I'm no longer silent, and if anyone can hear my voice, let me say this: justice doesn't come from what the system allows. It comes when we stop asking for permission." No applause, but dozens in the crowd nodded. A middle-aged woman wiped away a tear. A teenager clutching a backpack clenched his fist, not out of hate, but because, for the first time, he saw an adult speak aloud what he'd always thought but never dared to say. James ended with one line: no backdrop, no citation. "Silence has killed more people than guns ever had to shoot. And if my voice can save even one child from being seen as a shadow, I'll speak until the breath is gone." And then he stepped back. No bow, no lingering. Just as he used to walk away from the bench, this time he left behind a fire. The moment James Brooks stepped off the platform, the square fell into a strange kind of stillness, not from lack of reaction, but because no one wanted to disturb the echo of what had just been said. Then a voice rose from the middle rows: "Khalil Jameson." Another followed: "Khalil Jameson." Then a cluster of teens stood up, hands over their hearts, repeating the name like a low, steady drum. No one gave the signal. There was no official chant. But within a minute, the name, once buried under insufficient evidence, had become a living invocation. No one had to explain it. The crowd simply understood. They didn't want any more names to be forgotten like that again. One student recorded the moment on their phone and uploaded it with the caption, "Kahil Jamal, he didn't have to shout," and hundreds stood up. Within hours, the video spread across social media. The hashtag Khalil Jamison appeared tens of thousands of times, posted by everyday people, law students, journalists, and even a few young officials. Several high schools organized a Minute of Justice on Monday morning, where students took turns reading the names of those forgotten by systemic violence. A group of former police officers held a closed-door discussion, their first public acknowledgement of the harm caused by a culture of silent complicity in the force. The speech didn't just stir emotions, it activated memory and a legal reaction. The Justice Department began receiving requests from multiple municipalities asking for support in reopening previously closed cases. In Charleston, the ripple effect needed no orchestrator. Residents began holding justice name readings at churches, schools, and even in empty lots within neighborhoods, where people once feared gathering. James didn't appear at all these places, but it was his absence that confirmed it. The fire had outgrown the man. He was no longer the centerpiece, but the catalyst. An independent journalist wrote, "James Brooks didn't create the wave. He was the first crack in the dam. Everything after that was what the system had been holding back for too long." An 11th grade student said during a social studies presentation, "We don't just want to learn what's right. We want to live somewhere where if something's done wrong to us, someone will speak up, or we will." At a special meeting, Charleston City Council was forced to open a public hearing to review cases closed between 5 and 10 years ago. One council member, after 14 years in office, admitted for the first time, "If people still remember that boy's name after all these years, it means we didn't do our job." When night fell again, James returned to the park bench. No reporters, no applause. He just sat there, quietly, like every morning before. But this time he was no longer surrounded by the space of forgetfulness. From a distance, a few passers-by nodded respectfully. A young person laid a small flower at his feet with a handwritten note. "Thank you for not walking away." James looked at it, didn't smile, just nodded slightly, because he knew his voice had become a flame, and from now on, it would be the young who kept that flame alive. That morning, sunlight still poured onto the front steps of James's home, just as it always had, but when he opened the door to collect the newspaper out of habit, something else lay between the second and third brick. An unmarked white envelope. No stamp, no seal, no return address. Just his name, handwritten in blunt script. No salutation, no courtesy, as if the writer didn't see him as someone worth addressing. Inside was a single, precisely folded sheet of paper. No header, no opening, just one line, centered on the page in Arial font, size 14, "Stay silent." 3 words, a command, cold, emotionless, no explanation, but that was what made it hit harder, a silent cut aimed at the moral backbone James had tried to keep unbroken. He didn't react immediately. He sat on the steps, letter in hand, staring at the line as if the ink could betray the face behind it. But the printed font was a dead end. What James did sense was the sender's intent, not to provoke, but to paralyze. A part of him wanted to toss it, call it petty, cowardly noise, but he knew better. Ignore cowardice long enough and it grows venomous. He called Nathaniel. That afternoon, the envelope and letter were placed into a sealed evidence bag. Forensics found nothing. No prints, no DNA, no stray fibers. Even more unsettling, the paper was government-issued. The same type distributed internally across Charleston City Department's same weight, same finish, same origin. It wasn't surprising. What chilled James wasn't the content, but the quiet that followed. No reaction, no responsibility. And from the next day, a cruiser started parking farther out at the park. But it never left during his morning stay. It didn't flash lights, didn't approach. It simply remained. "This isn't a threat," Nathaniel told him in a parked car. "It's a message, not for you, but for anyone watching. It says, this man can be touched, and if he's not afraid, watch how far we'll go." James nodded. "Then we'll see how far they think they can go." The DOJ forensics team worked nearly 36 straight hours. When they returned with the results, the atmosphere among the federal task force shifted. A test print from Charleston PD's second-floor administrative office printer matched the threat letter exactly. "We checked every job log. Most were erased, but not all," said the lead investigator. The restored records showed a print job at 9:46 p.m., the night before the letter appeared. User ID admin7CA high-level system account, reserved for senior officers or privileged IT staff. Nathaniel stared at the evidence, hand like stone. So someone used public infrastructure to intimidate a citizen demanding justice? He didn't need an answer. The real fear came not from the act, but from the confidence behind it. Whoever did this wasn't afraid of being exposed, or believed they never would be. That kind of arrogance could only come from protection, from within. An emergency meeting was held that night. DOJ ordered full retrieval of printing, computing, and network logs for the past 14 days. A federal tech response team was deployed with forensic gear capable of recovering overwritten data and system traces. By sunrise, Charleston PD received an all-staff memo. Every computer would be scanned, all user accounts temporarily suspended, and data access limited. The mood turned. In public, some officers shrugged it off. In private, upper admin staff began wiping drives, re-encrypting files. They knew the storm had become real. Tuesday, 7:00 a.m., a convoy of black, unmarked vehicles entered the Charleston PD gates. Within minutes, the IT floor and internal network command center were sealed. Signs in bold red read, "BY Federal Order. Do not enter during active investigation." DOJ hadn't warned them. They didn't need to. With hard proof from the printer trace, the lockdown was authorized by a federal inspector general. Servers, backup drives, terminals, everything was seized and packed into anti-Xanac cases. No more access. No more deletions. At least, not technically. On the third floor, home to the department's internal network systems, 2 DOJ techs sat before monitor banks, combing logs. Within 6 hours, they uncovered a pattern. Admin accounts, deleting folders, encrypting mystery files, activating ghost user mode, a method known only to insiders. Some files were renamed to gibberish. Others are hidden in cache memory, absent from all main directories. Subpoenas were issued to 7 IT and systems managers, demanding they explain every action in the last 2 weeks. 2 failed to appear. 1 locked down their personal account the moment the lockdown was announced. Whispers turned into suspicion. "I haven't seen a mood like this in 20 years, said a veteran officer. "No one trusts anyone anymore." In the hallway, a young admin clutching a portable drive was stopped and surrendered without a word. In the afternoon staff briefing, Nathaniel entered and said little, just one order. From now on, all technical systems, software, and storage infrastructure are no longer under CPD control. Federal oversight begins now. No objections, no protests, just silence. The kind that spreads when people realize the walls they trusted are starting to fall from the inside. 4 days after the server lockdown, the tone of news coverage began to shift. Gone were headlines like "Witness Threatened," "Police Printer Traced," or "Feds Expand Internal Investigation." In their place appeared softened lines, wrapped in the sugarcoat of language. "Under review, internal technical procedures, focus of investigation shifts to administrative oversight of printing systems." Unverified sources suggest no evidence of systemic abuse of power. At a city press conference, the mayor's spokesperson stood behind a polished wooden podium, voice deep and professional, reading from a prepared statement. "We trust that all relevant authorities are doing their utmost to ensure transparency. However, we urge the public not to rush to judgment and not to let unverified information damage the image of those who protect this city day and night." Luis Ortega watched the press conference on his phone, seated at a small cafe with 2 members of the independent investigation team. He smirked. "They're definitely protecting something, just not sure who," another team member remarked. "This is the media containment phase. They're not denying anymore. They're smothering the fire with a blanket." Meanwhile, on local channel CTC News, which had been relatively objective in the early stages, a new commentator appeared, self-described as a public relations and behavioral analyst. On a primetime segment, she said, "We must not let emotion override logic. One bad actor doesn't represent the whole institution, and excessive scrutiny of a department like the police may only create unnecessary tension for the community." When asked about the threatening letter sent to James, she replied, "I believe it requires further verification. It may have come from an overzealous individual and doesn't necessarily reflect the intent or culture of the broader organization." At home, James Brooks watched the clip sent by his nephew. He didn't get angry. He just sighed. Words without truth are just low-dose anesthesia. They prolong the pain but cure nothing. On social media, the narrative began to polarize. One side called it a reasonable effort to stabilize public discourse. The other called it plainly a whitewash. But unlike many times before, the second group had video, reports, and witnesses. Luis and the team actively shared public document links, internal memos, print logs, server network diagrams, and time-stamped deletion entries. No drama, no fabrication. The facts were heavy enough to speak for themselves. At a community town hall, Louise spoke bluntly. If what we've uncovered is unverified, then I'm ready to sit down and debate any official who's brave enough to deny it. But they won't come. They just send press releases, soulless and answerless. That statement was quoted in hundreds of posts. Online, people began referring to the phenomenon as the white velvet curtain, a metaphor for the way media gently masked injustice with poetic spin. But in many hearts, a question began to ring louder. If they're not afraid of the truth, why are they rewriting it? On a Friday night, in the basement of the temporary headquarters for the independent investigation team, Luis Ortega and two legal analysts were combing through ad contracts and public financial records from CTC News. The documents weren't easy to trace. But thanks to a South Carolina media transparency law, they uncovered a chain of pass-through ad payments via 3 intermediary companies. All technically, said Malik, one of the analysts. But weird thing is, all 3 are registered at the same office building, 4212 Broadmoor. Luis frowned. Who owns that building? Malik replied. An entity called the Liberty Way Foundation? Sounds like a scholarship group, but wait. He opened another tab and searched for political contributions. Within minutes, a detailed chart appeared. Liberty Way had funded campaign contributions for 3 state legislators, one of whom currently sat on the Charleston Police Oversight Board. The final link, Liberty Way's 2023 financial report, listed a line item for strategic local media partnerships, totaling over $750,000, 0 cents. Most of it routed through a PR firm named Elmstream, the parent company of CTC News. Louise straightened in his seat. So, they're not just shielding the police. They're controlling the media narrative to kill the truth before justice even gets airtime. James Brooks was invited the next morning. After hearing the findings, he wasn't surprised. I lived through a time when newspapers just left out a black man's name if he got beaten, and that made it like it never happened. Now they're doing the same thing, just using video instead of a printing press. The team held a small press briefing, streamed live, releasing the entire financial map, intermediary contracts, and funding reports. No accusations, no labels, just data, figures, and money trails. Louise closed the briefing with one line. We're not saying they're manipulating the narrative, but if the truth is strong enough that they're willing to fund the opposite, then maybe we should ask what are they afraid of. Within 12 hours, a reporter from a national network launched a cross-check investigation, verifying the records and connections. The hashtag #FollowTheMic began trending. Users dug up past CTC News reports, finding that nearly every headline involving James Brooks, Luis Ortega, or internal investigations used vague, cautious language, carefully avoiding mentions of race or systemic abuse. An independent online survey showed that 72% of Charleston residents believed local media had not accurately represented the situation. Some employees at CTC began anonymously leaking internal emails, frustrated at being told to soften negative tone in stories related to the Justice Department. Facing public pressure, CTC issued a statement. We remain committed to neutrality and will be reviewing our editorial processes and financial partnerships. But public trust had already cracked. Luis received hundreds of anonymous messages, most of them supportive. One read, "For the first time in years, someone had the courage to name the power everyone else avoids." As for James, when asked at a community event whether he thought the media would change, he simply said, "We don't need them to change. We just need enough people to see clearly so they can't pretend anymore. The special hearing room at Charleston City Hall had never been this crowded on a weekday morning. Extra chairs lined the hallway. Cameras from 5 major news outlets were positioned at 3 angles, and lights from above cast a harsh glow that made the room feel hot and thick, like the air before a storm. But the only one sweating was Darren Cole. He entered from the side door, no longer in uniform. White shirt, sleeves slightly creased, tie loosened. He wasn't in handcuffs. This wasn't a criminal trial. Yet, the way security escorted him, and the look from the review panel left no confusion. He was the one on the stand. No more superiors to cut off the press. No more internal memos to shield behind. Only records, witnesses, and the truth, now dragged into the light. Darren glanced toward the gallery, where the eyes of people he had once labeled disturbances to public order now stared back at him. They didn't shout. They didn't curse. Their silence felt like a verdict. Wordless, but absolute. He used to believe power resided in the gun, in the clipped orders like, "Where's your ID? Sit down, or you resisting?" But now power resided in the waiting, the room quiet, holding its breath for him to speak. And whatever he said would be examined under the lens of justice and the exhaustion of a community wronged for far too long. The chairman read a brief opening statement. "Today we convene this hearing to examine the conduct of Officer Darren Cole in a series of incidents suggesting civil rights violations, and to allow the primary witness, Mr. James Brooks, to deliver a voluntary public statement at the request of the Federal Oversight Committee." His tone was neutral, unjudging, but each word landed like a nail tapping on a steel box Darren could no longer seal shut. He sat at the hearing table, facing forward. The lights bore down directly, no shadows to hide in. Not like those old offices where his superiors once told him, "Don't worry, this'll blow over." Not like those closed-door meetings where words like sensitive and internal were used to bury accountability. This time, everything was exposed, and for the first time in his life, Darren Cole had no darkness to retreat into. The back door opened. No announcement, no escort. But when James Brooks stepped through, the entire room seemed to hold still for a beat. No one had to be told. Every head turned, every eye paused, as if they were witnessing a century walk through a doorway. He was just as always. Plain white shirt, light brown coat, carved ebony cane. No attempt to look like a victim, no effort to seem defiant. He walked in upright, each step measuring the space with the gravity of a lifetime. Darren looked up. He wasn't surprised, but the flicker in his eyes betrayed him. A moment of hesitation, then quiet withdrawal. No words needed. It was clear to everyone. Between these two men, it wasn't about who stood or who sat, but who carried the greater moral weight. James didn't look at Darren right away. He walked straight to the witness chair, set his cane aside, and adjusted his collar. The moderator asked him to take the oath. He did, his voice low, steady as stone. "I, James Elijah Brooks, swear to tell the truth." Just one sentence, but something rang out in the hearts of the younger people in the room, a recognition that truth finally had someone old enough to bear it, calm enough to speak it. He looked around, not pausing too long on anyone, but long enough that those met by his eyes instinctively looked down. Then, at last, he turned to Darren. His gaze wasn't that of revenge. It was the gaze of someone who had long since forgiven, but would never forget. No accusations, no sharp tone, but the silence between them in those first seconds said more than any indictment. And what made the room go still wasn't hate, but quiet shame, the kind that comes from realizing a system had been allowed to do this for so long, so often, with no one speaking up. James didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't plead. He just sat, and in that calm, he made another man feel smaller than if he were kneeling. "Mr. James Brooks," the moderator said, "you have the right to address the subject of this inquiry. This is a voluntary statement. No obligation." James gave a slight nod. He didn't look at the moderator, only at Darren. "You once said," James began, voice deep, "that you were just doing your job, that you were following orders, that it wasn't personal." He paused. One beat, two. The room held its breath. "I was sitting on that park bench like every other morning, not threatening anyone, not making noise, not breaking any law, but you approached, hand near your gun, with eyes that had already defined me before I said a single word. Darren shifted. He wanted to object, but there was no gap to slip through. No document or statute could deny the way he had looked at that man that day. You weren't forced to hate me, James continued. His eyes weren't accusing now, just cold, clear truth. That was your choice. The room seemed to pull inward. One sentence, just one. But it laid bare an entire web of excuses, because prejudice, as James had just shown, wasn't imposed. It was chosen, silently, between the individual and the power they'd convinced themselves was always right. You could have, James went on, could have asked respectfully, could have followed protocol, if that's what you truly believed in. But you chose something else. You chose to make me a subject for inspection, not because of what I did, but because my existence didn't sit right with you. Darren looked up, meeting James's eyes for the first time, and in that look something broke. Not quite regret, not quite defiance, but a quiet collapse. He knew, in that moment, nothing could shield him now. James didn't press charges, didn't demand restitution. He left only silence, just as he had on the park bench that day. But this time, that silence became the loudest voice in the room. No one stood to applaud, no one wept aloud, but everyone in that chamber understood. Something had ended, and something else had begun, with a sentence that didn't need to be shouted. On Monday morning, the third-floor hallway of the federal prosecutor's office remained as quiet as usual. But the eyes of those working there no longer carried the ease typical of the start of the week. Rumors of a voluntary confession, from within the system itself, had spread like vapor on cold marble floors. Then, at 9:17 a.m., Lieutenant Robert Griggs arrived. He wore plain clothes, a light blue shirt, no badge. No lawyer accompanied him. He carried only a thin folder, and walked into the Department of Justice's Special Evidence Intake Office, asking to meet directly with the officer overseeing the Khalil Jamison case file. "This is the part you don't have," Griggs said, his voice low and slightly trembling, "and the reason is, I took it out." The room stilled. The note-taker froze mid-sentence. The two investigators exchanged glances and nodded, and they led him into a private room. No pressure, no charges. Just a voice recorder in front of him and a cup of tea still warm. Griggs began speaking. Slowly, like each sentence was a step on sinking sand. 5 years earlier, when the Khalil case happened, he had been the officer assigned to coordinate the incident report. At the time, Darren Cole had been the officer who pursued and detained Khalil, a black teenager suspected of stealing a car. He had no weapon and had already stopped running when ordered to. But in the official report, Griggs had been advised to adjust the response time, delete the street corner surveillance footage, and remove the testimony of an independent witness. The suggestion came from the supervising sergeant on scene, but Griggs knew who had really pushed for it: Darren. And the justification, as described by Griggs: "We can't have a newly transferred officer branded as a killer just because some kid didn't follow instructions." At first, I thought it was just about limiting liability, Griggs said. But when the video was replaced and the original file pulled, I realized this wasn't protecting the department. This was covering up a killing. He hadn't said anything back then, partly for fear of losing his job, partly because he too believed silence would make it all pass. But nothing passes forever, especially not when the silenced person is a child with no one to defend him. When James Brooks began to speak, when Luis made the emails public, when the printer exposed the truth, Griggs knew the moment had come. "I once held the coordination baton," he said, his eyes landing on James, who stood behind the hallway glass, "and you were the one who held a cane to stay standing. I don't want one more night in my life pretending I can't see what's happening right in front of me." Just 3 days after Griggs's statement, the federal prosecutor's office signed an order to reopen the Khalil Jamison case. The 17-year-old black teen shot dead during a pursuit in 2020, previously ruled unavoidable use of force, procedurally correct. But this time, no one would be allowed to rewrite the truth. The case file, once closed, was now reopened, with full video logs, original testimonies, and untampered timestamps. In the intersection camera footage that had been confiscated and now recovered from the city traffic server backup, Khalil appeared clearly, unarmed, nonviolent, and voluntarily stopping, hands raised. Less than 4 seconds after he stopped, a gunshot rang out. No warning, no negotiation, just a single bullet to the chest. Alongside the video was an audio recording of testimony from a witness named Maria Lawton, a university student who had seen the entire incident from across the street. She had called the internal hotline and left a message. "The police shot the boy for no reason. I'm willing to testify." That message never made it into the official file, but Griggs had kept a copy of the internal voicemail, never uploaded to the system, a burden of guilt that had now become evidence. Maria was contacted again. Her voice trembled in the first meeting, but when shown the video, she said one thing: "I know I didn't imagine it. They tried to make me believe I did, but I remember the look in his eyes and how it disappeared in an instant." Khalil had lived with his mother and younger sister. Poor, no lawyer, no one to speak up. Over 3 years, his mother received just 2 documents, one stating the internal review's conclusion, and another thanking her for her cooperation with the investigation. She never had the chance to ask a question, but now she was invited to the Federal Investigation Office, for the first time allowed to see the entire file, from the original report to the ballistic details of the bullet previously marked untraceable. In the new file, it was matched precisely to the service weapon Darren Cole had used that day. James Brooks was present at the first hearing on the reopening of Khalil's case. He did not speak. He simply sat, silently. In his hand was the same ebony cane that had walked through so many seasons of struggle. When the session ended, a student approached him and asked, "Sir, does justice ever come too late?" James didn't answer right away. He looked up at the symbol of the justice scale hanging high on the wall, then turned and replied, "It always comes late, but if we stop knocking, it never comes at all." The following Monday, the Department of Justice released an expanded subpoena list. In a single morning, 11 command-level officials, including 2 heads of internal affairs, 1 administrative commander, and 3 senior officers who had signed off on Khalil's file, were issued emergency summons. Some refused to comment. Some hired attorneys, but several, including Captain Alan Chalmers, former deputy of strategic coordination, began contacting investigators to clarify their roles. Their sudden cooperation wasn't driven by conscience, but by the realization that the system protecting them was beginning to crack. In a leaked internal report, one line stood out: "The directives to erase or amend files in civil cases involving racial or controversial elements often followed repeated response patterns, not isolated incidents." It was thunder in a clear sky, a confirmation of what citizens had whispered for decades, that a machine existed to blur truth, not just the failings of a few. Preliminary findings also identified 5 other cases with signs resembling Khalil's, 2 of which had victims whose names were never even made public. At the Charleston Police Department, the atmosphere shifted, like pressure before a storm. Hallways grew quieter, office doors shut earlier, and meetings were suddenly postponed indefinitely. Some younger officers began asking public questions, joining internal forums, something that had never happened before. One officer wrote on the breakroom bulletin board, "If you once chose silence, now is your chance to undo it. If not, you're part of it." DOJ Representative Nathaniel Chambers himself issued a firm statement. "We don't investigate feelings, we investigate actions, decisions, and the systems that allowed them to exist for as long as they did. This is no longer about Khalil. It's about stolen trust and who let it go without answering for it." When James Brooks heard that line, he simply nodded. His eyes no longer burned with rage. Only patience remained, as if he'd been waiting for this storm his whole life. 3 weeks after the Khalil Jamison case was reopened, while public outrage still simmered and city officials scrambled to regain balance, a formal invitation arrived at James Brooks's home. Mr. James Elijah Brooks is hereby invited to serve on the Advisory Council for Reforming Charleston's Security and Justice Systems. The letter was signed by the mayor and co-issued from the office of the federal prosecutor. There was no media splash, no press conference, just a political gesture sent to someone everyone knew couldn't be swayed by titles. James read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and replied with a single handwritten line, "I will join if I'm allowed to speak the truth and act on it." The first meeting took place in City Hall's chamber. 2 long tables, 4 internal use cameras, and 12 seats for invited members, officials, scholars, community leaders, and a few police representatives. When James entered, no one spoke, but every eye turned. He sat at the end of the table in a coarse jacket, cane resting beside his foot, no DR or commissioner prefix needed. But throughout the meeting, every statement seemed to recalibrate its rhythm to his presence. When the council chair presented the initial 47-page reform draft, full of terms like retraining, enhanced dialogue, and internal oversight committees, James didn't immediately object. He read every page, underlined phrases, marked paragraphs that took 3 lines to say what should take 1. Then he looked up and said, slow but sharp, "I'm not here to hear words that make us feel like we did something. I'm here to ask, how many of these give a citizen something they can point to and say, 'This is my right'?" The room fell silent. A police rep clicked his tongue but stayed quiet. The chair forced a polite smile and said, "We're open to more concrete proposals," James replied. "Then let's start. Cut 30% of the preamble. Add this clause: mandatory community feedback for all complaints, recorded, signed, and answered in writing. Without that, this is conscience management, not reform." At the council's 3rd meeting, a 30-minute presentation from an administrative expert opened the session on multi-tiered interagency coordination for equitable community oversight. It sounded impressive, but to James, it was hollow, word-heavy, action-light. He waited until the speaker finished, then raised his hand. Not high, but firm. "Let me ask," he began, "if an officer threatens an innocent citizen, and that person files a complaint, how many layers must they go through in your model before someone with authority hears them?" The room paused. No immediate answer. The police department's HR director fumbled. "In the current structure, possibly 3 to 5 levels, depending on severity." James nodded, then said plainly, "So before justice arrives, they must survive 3 institutions that once ignored them. That's not reform." The air turned cold. A law institute rep tried to respond. "We need process to ensure fairness from all sides." James didn't snap, but didn't bend either. He spoke as if addressing himself or a future generation. "I've sat in many chairs. The witness chair, the victim's chair, the nameless seat in the waiting room. But there's one seat I've never taken. The one you occupy just so the system looks like it's listening." That line drew a sharp boundary between 2 worlds. One clinging to order, the other demanding to expose what rotted underneath. After that meeting, the draft was halted, pending structural review. James submitted 3 conditions. 1. All internal investigators must be approved by an independent civilian board with veto power. 2. Any complaint showing signs of interference or delay beyond 30 days is escalated to federal oversight. And 3. Community members shall have public access to internal disciplinary records, except parts affecting personal safety. "Reform doesn't start with reports," he said before leaving. "It starts by rewriting what we were told couldn't change." 2 weeks after the final meeting, a new draft was printed and distributed to all council members. Same gray-white cover, but the title had changed. No longer Reconstruction of Oversight and Enforcement Frameworks. It now read simply the Charleston Civil Justice Act. The bureaucratic jargon was gone. In its place, clear clauses, enforceable deadlines, real oversight mechanisms. The first page read, "This draft is the result of consensus between government representatives and community voices. Those who endured witnessed and were once forced into silence. Below were 11 signatures and one bolded name, James Elijah Brooks. The new draft introduced 3 core reforms. First, the creation of a Community Direct Response Committee, CDR, with full authority over civil complaints, half its members drawn directly from the public, without agency approval. Second, the implementation of open and automated reporting, making internal disciplinary records, excluding safety-sensitive items, publicly available every 3 months. Third, the introduction of shared accountability, holding any party who obstructs or delays an investigation liable alongside the original offender. Not everyone approved. Some police reps asked to withdraw their names. But with public pressure mounting and DOJ backing the effort, the mayor signed off on submitting the bill to the state legislature. When asked why he didn't name the reform after himself, James simply smiled. "I've seen too many things named after the living, then thrown away once they're gone. I don't need my name here. I need the terms to survive me." Still, one mark remained, a short preamble, like a dedication, proposed by Luis Ortega and passed unanimously. It read, "This reform was driven not by anger, but by memory, and the strongest memory is of those who sat quietly on the bench, were questioned but did." On the day the draft was released to the public, hundreds gathered in the city square not to protest, but to stand in silence for 11 minutes. Marking the 11 months, Khalil Jamison was forgotten in the dark. Luis stood beside Khalil's mother. James sat across the street on a familiar bench, hand resting gently on his cane. He didn't give a speech. He didn't reread the clauses. Everything that needed to be said had already been written, signed, and this time, justice bore the stamp of the people themselves. By 6 in the morning, the roads leading into Charleston Square had already begun to fill, not with sirens or rallying cries, but with quiet clusters of people walking in from all directions. They carried handwritten signs, shirts with Khalil's name printed on them, or simply a gaze that had decided it would no longer look down. No one waited for a signal. No one needed a leader. Each arrival was its own declaration. "I'm here, I know, and I can't pretend I don't anymore." By 8, the square was packed. There was no stage, no security barrier, no familiar political faces taking turns at a microphone. Here, no one asked for permission to speak, and no one waited their turn. It began in silence. Then from that silence, voices slowly rose, telling stories. A father questioned for picking up his son late. A college student pulled from her car at night because she fit a description. An elderly woman who once hid her ID card out of fear of the neighborhood patrol's stare. In the middle of the square, there was no James Brooks on a raised platform. He gave no speech. He didn't raise his hand. He stood like everyone else, an older man with a familiar cane, surrounded by a circle of younger people listening to one another. But no one mistook him for a bystander. It was his quiet presence that reminded everyone this wasn't a movement for one man. This was the echo of years bent out of shape, finally trying to straighten themselves. A young, brown-skinned girl stood in the crowd, holding a megaphone with a dead battery. Her voice was faint, yet those nearby leaned in to hear. And when she ended with, "If justice won't say our names, then we must say them ourselves," dozens behind her repeated, "Say them ourselves." No one organized a chorus, but each person became part of an unwritten manifesto. On a stone wall, someone had taped slips of white paper, each listing the name of a person whose case was never reopened. Each sheet carried a surname, an age, a cause of death still under investigation. When the wind blew, some pages flew off. No one picked them up. They let them fall, as a reminder that for too many years truth had been blown away, just like that. Today, they had not come to chase the wind, they came to stand. And that, alone, was what the system had never dared imagine could happen. Amid the crowd, no one pointed and said, "That's the leader," but all eyes still found him, standing at the edge of Charleston's old memorial platform, ebony cane leaning against his left leg, a worn brown coat on his shoulders, and his eyes looking not at someone in particular, but at everyone. No one told James to be there, no chair was reserved, no honor cordon was drawn, and yet, as if by unspoken agreement. People naturally made space around him, not to worship, but so he would not disappear into the crowd. And that, more than any speech, made him the invisible anchor of a leaderless uprising, without microphones, without a script, without a spotlight. The young people near him dared not disturb him, but all snuck glances. A group of college students huddled to read aloud parts of the reform bill recently passed, not in order, but each choosing a section that moved them most. When one girl read, "All internal disciplinary records showing signs of cover-up shall be referred to federal oversight," she paused, voice trembling. If this had existed in 2020, Khalil might still be alive. No one replied. But then a middle-aged man stepped closer, placed a hand gently on her shoulder, and nodded. He was the father of a boy once interrogated illegally, a case later marked insufficient grounds. No story needed a narrator. Yet somehow, they all flowed toward the same current, an injury long shared, heard far too late. James still said nothing. From time to time, he closed his eyes, lips pressed slightly together as if speaking with memory. He had stood in places like this before, when he was young, at the edge of a train station in Montgomery, or on the steps of a post office where people crowded to speak about the right to vote. Then, he had been one of the loudest voices, but now, he knew real strength didn't lie in the loudest shout, but in whoever could awaken hundreds more to speak. No commands, no stage, just presence. Child, around 7, held his mother's hand and whispered, "Mom, is that the man from the video?" She bent down and answered softly, "Yes, but he's not famous because of the video. He's been standing there for a long time. We just hadn't seen him before." That line passed through a few nearby listeners, and then no one said anything. Not because they had nothing to say, but because, in a protest with no center, everyone understood. Today, every voice was their own, not a proxy, not a symbol, not a borrowed cause. As the sun began to angle in from the southwest, a group of uniformed students walked in, forming a quiet line. They held no banners. Each wore a sign with the name of someone interrogated in the past 5 years, without any record filed. One student had written in black ink, "I'm not in the system, but I'm not invisible." Then, without signal or leader, the entire square chanted 3 words: "We see each other." Nothing more. But the words rippled through every body standing still. James opened his eyes. Wind moved through his coat. His back stayed straight. His cane stood firm by his leg. He didn't need to do anything. But it was precisely his stillness that made thousands realize what they hadn't dared to believe before. Justice is not a building. It is a presence in the right place at the right time from the right person. The next day, when the media reported on the leaderless gathering at Charleston Square, no one expected a ripple effect. Yet within 72 hours, 13 nearby counties saw spontaneous marches emerge, not as political movements or traditional protests. They began with a few dozen people, then hundreds, then thousands, all with one thing in common. No one grabbed a mic to lecture. People took to the streets not to please the press or unleash anger, but because they'd been forced for too long to walk around, lower their heads, or stay silent about what they knew was wrong. In Dorchester County, a group of high schoolers stood outside the local police station with a homemade wooden mailbox, written on it, "For every memory ignored, please write it again." Within 2 days it was full. Testimonies from mothers, fathers, and children who saw friends dragged from buses, questioned without guardians, held behind school gates for wearing the wrong uniform. In Columbia, a veteran stood in the middle of a main intersection, holding a sign, "I fought for freedom. Don't make me fight again. This time against you." He stood alone, but an hour later, the road was blocked by over 500 silent people behind him. No one waited for orders. No one asked if this was allowed. Administrative language had no effect in the face of honest footsteps. Those who once hoped someone else would speak for them now realized they were the voice. On social media, the phrase, "I will not step back," became the shortest, fastest-spreading declaration, not because it was promoted, but because it captured the exact feeling of thousands who had once pulled back, thinking they were alone. On Saturday night, James received a photo from students in Berkeley County. It showed a cane, not real, but drawn in white chalk on the pavement. Under it, a scribbled line, "We move forward," on the path you opened. He looked at it for a long time, then put the phone away. The next day he went back to the park, the same old bench, the familiar newspaper, the leather bag always by his side. But this time he wasn't the only one sitting. A 10-year-old boy came over and sat beside him, said nothing, just sat, back straight, eyes forward, and from afar, other footsteps were coming. No one stepped back anymore. The statue plan was announced at a hastily organized press conference. No live stream, no fanfare. The announcement came from the interim mayor, who had previously played a passive role in the investigations. Now she spoke with a voice slow, almost cautious. "We are not building this statue to glorify an individual," she said, "but to remember a collective moment, a moment when the entire city sat down, stood up, and chose not to stay silent anymore." She pulled the white cloth off a sketchboard. No clear figure emerged, just a smooth stone block, nearly as tall as an adult, with a bench beside it, empty. On the stone was the silhouette of a seated figure, head bowed slightly, hands resting on a cane, but there was no face, no name, no inscription. Questions flooded in over the next few days from the press and the public. Why not carve James Brooks' name? Not include one of his famous quotes? Who is the person sitting there? The city's response didn't ease the controversy, because he didn't want that. And because if there's a name, it becomes one man. Without a name, it can belong to anyone who's ever sat there. Some called it a denial of credit, a dilution of symbolism, but for many others, it struck something deeper. On social media, a high school teacher wrote, "If it had a face, it would be someone else's. Without a face, I see my father in it." The statue was planned for the center of Clearwater Park, right where James had sat each morning. When the construction team began drilling the foundation, an elderly woman brought her chair and sat nearby for hours each day. When asked why, she said, "To check not whether they're building it right, but whether they understand it." While other statues across America were being torn down for symbolizing division, Charleston was erecting one no one could claim, no one could own, but in which anyone might see themselves. What made it unique wasn't the material, it was the emptiness, a space for others to step into and fill with their own story. At first, public reaction to the faceless statue design was chaotic. Hundreds of comments poured into local forums daily. Some argued no name means erasing history. Others asked, if it's not James, then who? Anonymity is how people avoid accountability. A small group even launched a petition to add a bronze plaque with a specific tribute. But then, something unexpected happened. Those who had once stayed silent became the defenders of that intentional silence. A mother whose son had been wrongfully detained wrote a letter to the city council. "I don't want my son's name on anything. I just want someone, when they sit on that bench, to understand others once sat there in silence, so someone else could speak." The story spread in ways no one could control. Students began bringing paper to the park, sketching their own faces beside the statue, writing below, "What if I had been there?" A group of unhoused youth held a discussion circle on the construction platform, sharing how they'd been pushed off public benches for simply dozing off. No one told them to leave. On the contrary, passers-by stopped to listen. And in that unscripted quiet, the statue was beginning to be understood, not by looking, but by listening. One of the most memorable moments came on a Saturday afternoon, when Luis Ortega, the young officer who had once spoken out, sat silently beside the unfinished base. A child approached and asked, "Do you know who that is?" Luis just smiled and said, "I don't. But if you think you know, maybe you're right." The child's eyes widened. "So it could be anyone?" Luis nodded. "Yes, as long as they were ever forced to stay quiet and didn't choose hate." That night, someone wrote in chalk on the uncarved stone, "We don't need a face to recognize each other." Rain washed the words away by morning, but the meaning stayed. From that moment on, no one asked, "Who will be honored?" Instead, they began to ask, "How do I become worthy of sitting beside them?" There was no red ribbon, no speeches, no official host to cut a ceremonial line. The unveiling of the man on the bench happened on a quiet Sunday morning in spring. The sun had barely risen, but the park was full. No orders, no formal invitations. The word had passed through handwritten posts on social media. Tomorrow, 7 a.m., someone will sit on the bench. It could be you. And at 7 a.m. sharp, Clearwater Park was packed. People came, as promised, but no one fought for space. No one pushed ahead. They stood or sat in a circle around the stone, as if waiting, as if the most important thing was about to be spoken but never needed to be said. The statue was covered in plain canvas, not red velvet, no spotlight. When the old stone worker, the one who sculpted the figure's back, stopped up to remove the cloth, no one clapped. Not because they weren't moved, but because everyone knew this wasn't something to celebrate. It was something to keep. The statue appeared just as in the sketch, a quiet posture, head slightly bowed, cane between the knees, and the face left blank, a hollow space of light. Beside it, a stone bench, empty. And the first to sit there wasn't James Brooks. It was a 16-year-old boy named Elijah, brown skin, hoodie, notebook in hand. He sat quietly beside the statue, placed his notebook on its lap, and closed it. Then he stood, nodded, and walked away. Someone from afar began clapping, not loudly, just a steady beat, like the shared heartbeat of a community that had just touched something sacred they thought they had lost. Empathy without instruction. James stood far off, didn't step into the circle. He watched from a distance, hand resting gently on his familiar cane. Someone came to invite him to sit next to the statue. He just shook his head. "I've already sat, now it's their turn." And when the first rays of sunlight touched the statue's shoulders, something strange happened. No one left right away. They stayed. They talked to each other, to themselves, to memory. Children climbed onto the platform, placing their hands on the statue's back, as if asking, "Why won't he look at me?" But the adults didn't stop them. They let the children touch. Because the statue had no face, it could hold any story someone was brave enough to tell. No one left at once, but everyone who did leave knew this. They no longer stood alone. And from that day on, the stone bench beside the statue was never empty for long. Each day, someone sat, not to be photographed, but to remember. Someone once sat here, silent but steady. And if we sit right and speak right, we might be that person too. The sun broke through gently after a night of rain, the first rays slipping past the oak branches and falling on the old stone bench long familiar to the people of Charleston. Clearwater Park remained as quiet as ever, save for bird song and the soft hum of bicycle wheels from a few elderly morning exercisers. James Brooks had been sitting there before the sun rose, just like always. His ebony cane rested by his side, a thin notebook in his hands, and his gaze reached out into the distance, not focused on anything in particular, but unhurried. His silver hair caught a faint golden glow, and his worn white shirt carried a deliberate simplicity, like he refused the spotlight others tried to cast on him. Today was like any other day, and that's exactly what made it unforgettable. A group of students from the nearby high school entered the park, carrying notebooks, cameras, and curious eyes. They were working on a project for their sociology class titled Living Symbols of the City. None of them expected to find the real James sitting there. They'd seen him in videos, heard stories from their parents, and seen his name in a few articles. But seeing him here, in silence, on the old bench, made them all hesitate. No one spoke at first, until one girl softly asked, "Excuse me, sir, may I sit with you?" James looked up, smiled gently, and nodded. Half the bench was still empty, and it never had been by accident. One by one, the kids sat down on the grass or the edge of the brick path nearby. No one launched an interview. No one hit record. Instead, there were scattered questions. honest and deeply human. Were you ever scared? What were you thinking when the police asked for your ID? After everything, do you think it was worth it? James didn't answer right away. He let them ask, let them laugh, let them fall silent. And it was that silence that made them respect him even more. After a while, he opened his notebook and showed them an old photograph. It was him, younger, curly-haired, bright-eyed, standing in the middle of a protest crowd. Back then, we asked the same things you're asking now, he said, his voice low and steady. The only difference is you're allowed to ask them without fearing arrest. The group fell quiet. A silence with weight, not from sadness, but from realizing some questions once had a price. A boy wearing glasses, about 15, sat closest to James. His notebook was filled with scribbled questions. Yet he hadn't spoken all morning. Only when the others fell into hushed side conversations did he finally look up and speak, no longer hesitant, but like the question had waited too long to stay silent. "Sir, what did you fight for?" The question slipped out softly, like a breeze. Not loud, not demanding, just simple, direct, and real. The group froze for a beat. Though many questions had been asked before, it felt like this was the one they'd truly wanted to hear all along. Just one line, with clarity and weight. What for? James didn't answer right away. He looked at the boy, then at the others. The faces all turned to him, not with worship, but like people searching for a reflection of themselves. He drew a breath, eyes drifting toward the stone statue in the middle of the park, a place where people sat each day, not to be heroes, but to remind themselves they weren't alone. Then he turned back, his voice not loud, but steady enough for all to hear, each word landing like a small stone on still water, so that one day you could sit still without fear. There was no lecture after that, no further explanation, but each child understood, because in a world where simply sitting still could be seen as suspicious, where skin color or silence could be treated like a threat, being allowed to just sit truly and safely was a kind of power others had paid a lifetime to reclaim. One girl quietly pulled out her phone, intending to record the moment, but stopped. She put it down and simply watched. Someone began to cry softly, not from sadness, but from realizing something never taught in school. Some lives don't need statues or songs. They just need to be heard. And continued. James said nothing more. He closed his notebook, stood up slowly, and as he left the bench, no one moved to sit where he'd been. The bench still had room. Like an unwritten reminder, that space was for the next person. The story of James Brooks isn't just a confrontation between an elderly black man and a biased police officer. It's a mirror reflecting how society sees, and too often rushes to judge, a person by skin color or age. James didn't shout, didn't rage, he simply sat, and in that stillness, he made an entire power structure hesitate. The lesson isn't new, but it's urgent. Never judge anyone by a stereotype. A quiet man on a park bench might carry an entire era of struggle within him. Strength and worth aren't found in noise, but in the ability to hold dignity without needing to raise your voice. For the millennia, men and women spent their lives. Justice may be slow, but it doesn't lose its way, as long as someone keeps the flame alive. Have you ever been misunderstood just because someone didn't take the time to know you? Have you ever been underestimated, then quietly proved them wrong? If this story made you think of yourself or someone you know, share it. Sometimes a story like this can stop someone in their tracks and make them see differently. And if you want to stay connected with stories that are honest, inspiring, and brave, hit subscribe. Justice isn't just about laws. It begins with how we choose to see each other, and how we choose to listen instead of judging. The bench still has room. The only question is, with what mindset